Hello, this is Just Listen, hosted by George. Today is March 12th, 2024. Today I want to talk about the federal government policy on voting, which I've talked about in the past, but specifically today I want to talk about the voter ID laws. As of January this year, 34 states require voters to present identification, and then 16 states do not require voters to present identification in order to vote. Why is this important? Because since the election season is in full bloom, you're going to hear one of the sides saying something bad about voter ID laws, and specifically, they're going to say that photo IDs are not fair. I'm going to dig into this and give you a couple of reasons why this is not true. First thing that we need to do is look at which states don't require identification. So if we look at the border states, and I'm going to provide this resource, which is pretty valid and not biased at all they're doing is looking at details. If you look at the map, and I hope that you do, you'll see that if we're looking at the border or where people cross to get into the country, you're going to notice that New Mexico, no ID required. Arizona, non-photo ID. And then you have California, no ID required. Why is that important? Well, we've got this big fight going on about border security, but that portion will be in a different update coming in the future. Back to the voter ID and specifically the ID. So if you look at these border states, you can see this pattern of the states don't require a photo ID. Except for Texas, like I said. I looked at Arizona. Arizona accepts forms of non-photo ID include utility bills, bank statements, and valid Arizona vehicle registration documents containing the voter's name and address. Why am I bringing up Arizona? Utility bills and bank statements? Couldn't someone just bring those in? Now let's look at Colorado. Colorado is one of 11 states that you don't have to have a photo ID, but look at what Colorado does. Accepted forms of ID include a driver's license, U.S. passports, and certified copies of U.S. birth certificates. Now that's major. So on the surface, it looks like that they're just saying no photo ID, but this is my caution, and this is why I like doing my podcast. You have to dig into the details and find out the information. Arizona, California, their state legislatures have made it pretty easy for people to vote. And you can go through and look at each state and then see what the legislatures have done. And in general, the states have decided that they want some kind of proof of someone's identity. So if we're tracking the 50 states, the majority of the states want to see something. not just utility bills and bank statements. The next section, reasons groups are against voter ID laws. And again, we're talking about the photo IDs. Now, the first one shouldn't surprise you if you watch any news service in the country. The claim is it disproportionately impact blacks, Native Americans, elderly, and student voters. And they claim the main impact is voter suppression. And I know that you guys have heard that at least the last decade. Now, I'm going to get to Native Americans. If you look at the elderly, I haven't heard any elderly person complain about being able to go and vote. As a matter of fact, they've changed the laws in some of the states that they can mail in ballots. And I know some of you think that those are suspect, but we're not going to focus on that part. The bottom line on that is that the elderly in general are not complaining about not being able to vote and given photo IDs. Student voters, in one of the states I checked, it was Colorado, you can present a student ID. The student IDs have your picture on them. So why would they be against showing a student ID that has a photo on it? Now we're back to blacks. When I'm watching the news, doesn't matter which network, they are being represented as the voter suppression. Recently, in 2022, Ohio signed into law that said that you have to show a photo ID. Some of you probably saw that on the news. And the other side immediately said voter suppression against one group. And if you go and check some of the online sources, you're going to see what I've been seeing. They're very biased and they don't balance it out and ask questions. The questions to ask, you would need a psychologist or a therapist. We don't know why people don't want to vote. We know what the activists are saying, but we do not know why sometimes people don't want to vote in general. Now, there was a court case called Shelby County versus Holder. I'm assuming that was the previous Attorney General. So this case would have been for a long time ago where the federal government during the Obama administration questioned why you needed to have a photo ID. And they lost. Holder lost. And the Ohio law is still in effect. Now, one thing of special note, I mentioned the Native Americans in the beginning, and I'm going to do a podcast about that because as I was reading, they have quietly complained about not being able to vote. So we're talking about states like South Dakota and Minnesota. But for our discussion, they are impacted. Claim is that their vote is suppressed because they have to come up with an ID. Now, the sources that I was looking at, they were biased, saying that, yeah, the photo ID creates voter suppression, which I do not believe that that's possible. Why am I doing this podcast? This is going to intensify this election cycle because the election between Trump and Biden is going to come down to 5 or 6 states. Showing an ID, proving who you are, doesn't hurt anyone. And the reasoning that the opposition is giving that people can't have a photo ID makes absolutely no sense at all. There is a primary going on in Mississippi, and I always talk about Mississippi because they have 40% black vote in that state, and for whatever reason, most of the black people in that state, they don't vote. And like I said previously, I'm not in anybody's head. I cannot tell you why they're not voting, but what I can tell you is that it's not voter suppression. The other piece of that is, if you look at these articles, these biased articles, first thing they go and do is go back to the 30s, 40s, and the 50s and point out various things that happen, and they're not relevant to what's going on with voting right now, and the fact that both sides should be aware of who is voting. And voter ID is very important, and we can't keep using being poor to say why people are not doing something like getting IDs. And as you are aware, my last point is to pretty much do anything in the country, no matter what state you're in, you need some form of identification. So these activists and these government officials who are trying to push against having a valid photo ID is not warranted at this time because it's not based on any facts. This is Just Listen, hosted by George. Please let me know what you think, because this is important to you this election cycle, to who becomes the next president of the United States.